Hello and welcome to random unscripted video number 1. This could be awful, this could be great, or it could be somewhere in the middle. I don't know. I just wanted to make a video and this is what you're getting. So the other day I watched the film Ida from 2013, directed by Pavel Pawlikowski. And it's really good, don't get me wrong, but it got me thinking about something that occasionally crops back up in my brain every now and then, specifically regarding filmmaking. And that is to do with the use of aspect ratios in a creative manner, which is something that I feel gets talked about a little bit, but not as much as it really should, because modern filmmakers specifically have taken that sole idea of using aspect ratios in a creative sense and have just kind of ran with it. And I wanted to do a whole video talking about some of the best examples that are out there and how you can use aspect ratios in a creative manner and how you can use it to really strengthen your ideas and your films that you make, because I presume some of you out there, like myself, are amateur filmmakers who are trying to experiment and try new things. And this is something I've wanted to talk about for a little while now, and I just feel like this is the best way to do it. I mean, as you can tell, this is an unscripted video. This isn't like my usual video essays. This isn't also going to be, this is not going to be a long history of the aspect ratio and how it came to be. It's nothing like that. This is just me talking about aspect ratios in general and how they can be used in a creative sense to strengthen a story of a film. So, like I said, part of the reason I wanted to do this video is because of the film I watched the other day, which was Ida, and in a lot of ways it is similar to Pawlikowski's more recent film from 2018, Cold War, which is a gorgeous film. Both Cold War and Ida are two beautiful movies, and I cannot recommend them enough. But when I was starting to think about the way Ida uses aspect ratio, I kind of did start to think that it's very similar to how Cold War did it. And it's a very simple and straightforward way of using an aspect ratio to strengthen the story that they're trying to tell, because both for Ida and Cold War they are very personal and intimate stories that lend themselves to not just the aspect ratio they're shot in, which for the sake of both films is 4:3, but also lend to the black and white aesthetic that the filmmaker has gone for. It started to make me think that both of those films, specifically considering they're both in black and white, they're both in the same aspect ratio, and they're both made by the same filmmaker, is that I don't think those films would work nearly as well if they weren't in those aspect ratios and in that color palette, purely because those films are both set in the 1960s. And with the use of that aspect ratio and with the use of the black and white color palette, it makes those films almost feel like films that would be released in the 60s, which is why those films work as well as they do. And this is where I start to think some people, not everybody, but some people in particular, don't fully realize how important an aspect ratio can be. I mean, the majority of movies nowadays are shot in your standard either 16:9 or full screen. But when a film deliberately goes out of its way, specifically one that's released nowadays, when it goes out of its way to put the film in a specific aspect ratio, you can tell that they're doing it for a creative reason. Funnily enough, a couple of weeks ago, some of you may have seen this, some of you may not. But a couple of weeks ago, I made this short little film thing called Escapism. Originally, I wasn't gonna release it as a kind of little short film. Initially, it was just a test for my new camera, which is the one I'm using now. But I thought the footage was so good that I would make a little short out of it. It's nothing serious. It's just a little tiny 5 minute long short film that just has a very loose story in it. And one of the most significant things about that little short that I made is that I decided to put it in a 4:3 aspect ratio. Now there are two reasons I did that. One, I felt that the aspect ratio fitted the aesthetic that I was going for with that film, because it felt very retro. It felt very vintage, as if it was from like the early 70s or something like that. And I thought a 4:3 aspect ratio just worked for the sake of that short. But also, 4:3 is an aspect ratio I've been wanting to find a reason to use in something that I've made. And to be honest, considering escapism is the first short film related thing I've made in quite a while, I thought, you know what, screw it, I'll put a 4:3 aspect ratio on it because I just thought it would add to the aesthetic of the film, like I said. However, someone that I know personally who watched that little short didn't quite understand the reason as to why I used the 4:3. They thought it actually kind of detracted from what little resemblance of a story there was that I was trying to tell. And generally, they just didn't like slash didn't understand the reason for me using a 4:3 aspect ratio. And to some extent, I can kind of see where they're coming from, but that's half the reason why I'm making this video, is to showcase and explain how aspect ratios can be used in a creative manner. Now, as an example, let's look at one of my favourite films of all time, Mummy, directed by Xavier Dolan, released in 2014. Now, rather than going with a 4:3 aspect ratio, Dolan decided to do the entire film in a perfect 1:1 square, which is the parameters of a picture that you see on Instagram. And for the sake of this film, it works tremendously well for two specific reasons. One, it gives the film a very unique look, because whereas with a 4:3 aspect ratio, you have a little bit of wideness to it that makes it just a slightly bit wider than a straight up perfect square, which kind of gives it a little bit of leeway with certain things. Whereas with a 1:1 square, you have little room for error. You have to make everything fit within a small frame, and it has to work. However, if you've seen Mummy, you will know that Xavier Dolan does something with that aspect ratio that kind of gives the film an extra layer that you didn't initially know it needed. Because when the film first starts, you just think the aspect ratio is there for aesthetic purposes. But halfway through the film, when Wonderwall by Oasis starts playing, and you get this montage of the mum starting her job and the main character, whose name I can't remember for some reason, being home tutored, and things are starting to look up for this family. Halfway through that montage, the main character literally pulls apart the aspect ratio to give way to widescreen. The entire screen is taken up with the image now. By having that significant thing happen halfway through the film, it shows that the aspect ratio was actually proving a point the entire time. The aspect ratio was there to show how bottled in and claustrophobic the main character's life has been up to that point, and the fact that he has not been able to fully feel free. And then when the montage happens and life is starting to look up for not just him but his mother as well, he is able to pull apart that aspect ratio. He feels free for the first time in a very long time. He feels like he is able, he is actually doing what he wants to do, and he feels unleashed. I know that probably sounds like the worst word to use, but he feels like everything's an open book now. Another modern filmmaker that plays around with aspect ratios quite a bit is Trey Edward Schultz, who I think does it in his debut film Krisha. I might be wrong. It's been a while since I've seen it. If there is a change of aspect ratio in Krisha, please let me know in the comments, because like I said, I haven't seen it for a while and I can't remember if the aspect ratio does change in that film. But the first film where I significantly noticed it from this director was It Comes at Night. Now, this film plays around with quite a few aspect ratios, nothing as drastic as 1 by 1 or 4 by 3, but this film instead decides to play around with aspect ratios that focus on the top and bottom of the screen rather than the sides. So you get things like 16 by 9, and then you get some really extreme versions of that where I think by the end of the film, the aspect ratio is just a very thin letterbox. Um, and I don't think it would work for any other film except for It Comes at Night, because the way uses aspect ratios is fairly simple, if a little bit inconsistent. The majority of the film, when you're witnessing something that's happening in the real world, is in full screen. When a dream sequence happens, that is when the aspect ratio starts to condense. Now, those two examples that I've just said are rather experimental and very creative uses of an aspect ratio that doesn't stay consistent. They change throughout the film. However, there are plenty of examples of modern films that keep to specific aspect ratios for specific reasons. For example, you have Robert Eggers' The Lighthouse, which is in a 4 by 3 aspect ratio, and is presented in black and white. And for a similar reason, I guess, to Ida and Cold War, it's done for aesthetic purposes and to purely put you in a specific time period and really emphasize that authenticity of that time period. But I guess you could say, for the sake of The Lighthouse, that aspect ratio of 4 by 3 adds a certain sense of claustrophobia to the whole thing as well, because it's a film about two people going nuts. Therefore, the aspect ratio being in the aspect ratio that it is kind of adds to that a little bit. Plus, you have films like The Grand Budapest Hotel by Wes Anderson, which has three different aspect ratios. However, unlike Mummy and It Comes at Night, it doesn't change between the two. Like, for example, with Mummy, the character pulls the aspect ratio apart. With It Comes at Night, you see these aspect ratios gradually seep into frame. With The Grand Budapest Hotel, it's really to the point and straightforward. You have three different time periods and three different settings being shown in three different aspect ratios. They don't slowly morph or transform. They literally go from 4 by 3 to 16 by 9 to the other one. I can't remember what the other one is. I apologize. But it literally just goes back and forth between the different aspect ratios without any fancy transitions. It just kind of goes, right, so this is this time period and you're being shown it in 4 by 3. Oh, and now we're going to go to this time period, so it will just change to 16 by 9. Also, that's something I should probably clarify. I know it's a bit late in the video to mention this, but screw it, it's unscripted. Everything's in the wrong order anyway. But when I'm talking about the creative use of aspect ratios, as you can tell, I'm specifically talking about the aspect ratios that are used in a creative sense. So when you get things like Michael Bay dicking around with God knows how many aspect ratios just because he filmed with a bunch of them and doesn't know which one to stick with, or when you have things like, I don't know, Christopher Nolan's movies where a specific action set piece was shot in IMAX, so the footage has to then change from, I don't know, 16 by 9 to IMAX footage, and you get a little bit of a jolt from the two aspect ratios changing. That's not the sort of aspect ratio stuff I'm trying to talk about. I'm specifically talking about aspect ratio changes or just aspect ratio choices in films that are there specifically for a creative reason. However, with that being said, there are one or two examples that do blur those two categories into one. Films that have shot in two different formats that have to somehow blend the two aspect ratios together in a creative manner, um, to make it either less jarring or, in the sake of Hunger Games Catching Fire, is a creative choice. So there is a moment in Hunger Games Catching Fire where Katniss is lifted up in an elevator to the main Hunger Games tournament arena thing, whatever it's called. And because for the majority of the film we've been, specifically in the scenes just before the tournament happens, we've mostly been confined to um, the small rooms that she's had to stay in, her and Peter, and all the other contestants. However, in this shot, when she is lifted up in the elevator to the main arena, the aspect ratio widens from 16:9 to full IMAX to fully emphasize that scale, similar to what Christopher Nolan tries to get across. But I think it is done really well in this moment in Catching Fire because it is a literal change in aspect ratio. It's being morphed from one to the other kind of subtly, because when I first watched the film, I never noticed that. However, with subsequent re-watches, and also noticing that a lot of TV shows and films kind of do a similar thing nowadays. Like I noticed Mandalorian season 2 did that once. Um, it's a really straightforward but simple thing that gets across the format change in a specific way, without making it too jarring, where it's literally just, oh, we're going to cut to another aspect ratio. So I guess there really isn't a point to this video other than the fact that it's me just trying to say that there are plenty of examples of filmmakers nowadays experimenting and trying new things with the visual medium in which they're trying to tell their stories. I mean, if you look at a lot of people nowadays on social media, they're having to fit the things they want to do and the stories they want to tell within the constraints of, say, the aspect ratio you're stuck with on Instagram, or the confinements of whatever aspect ratio a phone screen is. And even though I'm not a massive fan of all that, that sort of thing, you can tell that they're working within the confinements that they are working within. There are many aspects and avenues you can use in the context of filmmaking that can really heighten the story you're trying to tell or the specific emotion of a scene. And one of those many avenues you can go down is the route of an aspect ratio. Some people don't even notice it, but it is something that I have a lot of admiration for. If you're a creative voice in the film industry that's willing to try something different and something very ballsy, like a drastic aspect ratio change, but if you're doing it for the sake of either the characters, the story, the visual aesthetic of the film, or if it's trying to get across a specific point for the film that you're trying to make, then I feel like it's a risk that's worth trying. As you can tell, I kind of made this video a bit off the cuff, and didn't really have a specific focus of the video, and I just wanted to do a video talking about aspect ratios just because. But I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments some of your favorite uses of aspect ratio in the comments below, specifically in a creative sense. Also, if you're an aspiring filmmaker like myself, let me know in the comments if you've ever wanted to play around with different aspect ratios for creative purposes, or if you have done that, and I'd love to know how that worked out. So, yeah, if you enjoyed the video, then give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.